the question is how to deal with measurement when you're playing extremely fast. For instance, as you were saying, 16 notes at say 200 BPM. Now, if you say what you were talking about is to cut the measure in half and think in 100 BPM, you'd have to also divide the actual notes, so you make it 16 notes. Oh, 32nd notes, excuse me. You multiply it by 2, excuse me. So at 200 BPM, you'll be playing 16 notes. At 100 BPM, you're playing 32nd notes. In the end of the day, you're playing the same thing. It's like playing, you know, B flat or A sharp. It's the same note. You understand? So it's just it's more like a memory trick. You know what I mean? The question really comes down to: do you feel more comfortable tapping this and saying 1 again, a 2 again, a 3 again, a 4 again, like that, or do you feel more comfortable tapping this? You know what I mean? And just going, blah, 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 blah. You know what I mean? That's really what it comes down to. It's what's easier for you to feel, right? Most of the time, you know, because I see a lot of metal players like, oh, I play at 220 BPM. I'm like, you're a fucking idiot. Shut up. You know what I mean? Because they don't even know what they're talking about. You know, in reality, you know, if you're playing 32nd notes at 200, just take a calculator out and see how many notes that is per minute. It's like, you know, it's ridiculous. So if you want to say you're playing 32nd notes, you want to be like human, realistic, and not a machine. You're gonna be playing within like, you know, between like 80 and like 160 is like the average for a 32nd note. You know, so when it comes down to like dealing with the measurements, it really just comes down to what's easier for you to deal with at the time. I mean, for the most part, dividing the BPM in half makes your life a lot simpler because you can see a longer measure and you can deal with a lot more. But in the end of the day, it comes down to what feels right to you. Some people, it feels better to do that. Some people, it feels better to count the higher tempo. I play, in one hand, I'll play with a jazz band, and they'll be playing a fast tune. It's a lot easier to count it at 100. You know what I mean? And think, oh, I have a 32nd note run. But if I'm playing in a death metal band, like a grindcore band, you know, sometimes you need that extra click. You need to be counting eighth notes on the tempo. You know what I mean? In order to get the feel proper. You know what I mean? If I'm sitting there playing, you know, something with just like blast beats the whole time and like just like shredding, it's a lot harder sometimes to keep the flow when the click is only in half because there's too much missing space to quantize to connect to. You understand? So what it really, in the end of the day, comes down to is what do you feel more comfortable with? Do you feel more comfortable of hearing a quarter note click, or do you feel more comfortable hearing an eighth note click? Okay, does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it most deals with training, and while you're not comfortable with this, right, building your speed or something.
I think it's easier to follow the multiple. It's easier to follow an 8-note click track. Playing 200 BPM is easier to follow when you're playing fast because there's more for your brain to catch up to. Okay, every time it clicks is another chance for you to match, and the less clicks, the less chances of you matching it.
Yeah, so
a slower tempo.
Points of synchronization.
That's why playing slower tempos is a lot harder than playing faster tempos.
Yep.
Because your brain has less to react to. It has less slices to connect. So there's more dead space in between each click for your brain to match. You understand? So there's more guesswork involved.
Yep.
So the faster you play, it's usually easier to recognize a faster click. That's why most of the death metal bands and the guys who are self-taught tend to say, oh, I'm playing at 300 BPM. You know, really they're only playing at 150 and they're playing like 8 notes. You know what I mean? It's just that they don't understand the math behind it. They just know that this feels right when I do it because they can match easier.
Okay.
Okay?
See.
So again, the last week's lesson was that talking about the reaction time, and that's how the reaction time comes into play. You know, in one effect, because if you can only, let's just say like we were talking about the trained fighter, right, can react 10 times in a second. He has 10 slices in 1 second. The average person sees 4 slices in a second. You understand? So for an average person, if they don't have those extra clicks, they can't even comprehend it. You know, they have nothing to match to. Their brain isn't moving fast enough. There's too many things going on for them, so they don't have something to match. So the higher tempo is actually easier. So playing at 200 for somebody who doesn't really know how to play too well is usually easier than playing at 100 because there's nothing to match to. You understand? And like I said before, it's like the reaction time. It's like, you know, when you put those extra clicks, it forces the brain, the slower person's brain, to have to match. You know, there's a guide saying, "Oh, you missed one, you missed one, you missed one," constantly smacking you in the face.
But the thing is, just imagine the metronome. You put it on 200. It does click. It clicks. It's 200 bits.
Right.
But you accent every other note, so there's and your brain inside is like 100. So there's two things, like so you're accenting every other, so you're having 100 in your mind, but you actually play and you hear the click on the metronome.
Yes and no. If you're playing 16th notes at 200, right? Or just say make it easier. You're playing 8 notes at 200, right? What you're saying. You're accenting every other beat. So I hear a click, I have an accent on the empty space, right? So click, accent, click, accent, right? It's an empty space being accented.
Okay.
So 8 notes at 200. If you did that at 100, you'd be playing 16 notes. So within the empty space, at 200 BPM, 8 notes, you'd have 1 extra beat in the empty space. At 100, you'd have 3 extra beats in the empty space, because that 8th note becomes a 16th note.
Yep.
You understand? So the empty space, there's nothing to quantize, there's nothing to connect to measure. So the brain has to sit there, and that's why people have a lot of trouble learning how to use a metronome, because most teachers start you with this, oh, you have to start at this retardedly slow speed. It's so slow that you can't even deal with it. There's no measurement, and you're not learning to internalize the time. You understand? So it's the way I teach it.
You gotta feel the gap in between these
right.
beats. Yeah.
I mean, a natural measurement for a person is between a second and a half a second. So I always start people between 60 and 80, you know, 60. You know, I say 60 to 80, 90 beats per minute, okay? Because that's natural. People know 1/1000, 2/1000. It's approximately a second. People feel a second. It's not exact, but it's a natural unit that people associate with. So that is where I always start people. And a lot of people, oh, you have to learn everything super slow, and again, extreme on either side is no good. But if I was going to say as a teaching aid, I would always say the faster tempo, to double the tempo on the metronome. Because again, the more clicks, the more the brain has to associate to the click, the less room for error. Okay, the more empty space, the less to associate, the more errors you're going to make, because you have to guess. You have to guess where that next click's going to come. And that's where the error comes in when you're learning to use the metronome. Is that your brain's sitting there, yeah, 1/1000. You know, and then you're trying to catch up to it. You miss it, you're early, you miss it, you're early. There's no continual.
Yep.
So starting at a natural frame, 60 beats per minute, 80 beats per minute, until a person internalizes it. And then they go back to a slower tempo when they understand mechanical time. Because real life is not symmetrical. Human beings are not perfect. And you know, that learning to play to metronome time, it's great when you're, for a professional musician who's like learning to like play on an album or play with other people. But when you're just starting to learn to play music, the metronome is like your worst enemy, because it's so unnatural. You understand? That the whole right angle and the whole, it's not a natural thing. So I always say, like, and you know how I teach it, the metronome is a tool that should be used sparingly. When people try to lock themselves onto the metronome and like worry about so much, you destroy your whole sense of like being human and sound like a musician. That's why you have these guys that sound like robots, and you know, like some of the greatest guitar players. You know, they shred their asses off and they sound perfect, but they don't sound real. They don't sound like people. You know, and that's why they don't ever really get to that level of like superstardom. You know, like people talk about this Yngwie Malmsteen all the time. Real guitar players who listen to Yngwie Malmsteen, the guy's a fucking sloppy piece of shit. I'll tell you straight up. You know, composing is great, genius. You know, puts a lot of crazy stuff together. But if you listen to him and you know how to play, you're gonna hear so many little mistakes, so many screeches, and so many like bumps. And like when he plays live, I see him play this orchestra. I was disgusted at how many mistakes he made. You know what I mean? But again, as to what are you measuring to, you know? And the fact that he makes those mistakes, and the fact that he isn't exactly perfect, is what makes his sound lively and sound real. Okay? Like, to the average person, again, we're talking about the reaction time. Average person only hears 4 clicks in a second. They cannot comprehend the in-between. So people who aren't trained in music, they don't hear his mistakes. They don't hear his screeches and his, the missed picks and the missed notes, because they go by so fast that their brain doesn't see it. You understand? Someone who's trained to hear those little things. But at the same time, those nuances, those mistakes, those little sloppy things is what makes it sound real. So that's why I say it's sometimes you know, to try to live up to these standards of perfection is unrealistic, and it actually kills the idea of being musical. You know, so stay away from that.
Okay, thanks.